Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. In the town of Ashford, there stood an old church on the highest hill. Its bell tower loomed over the town, a relic of another time. But no one attended the church anymore. The doors were locked. The windows were boarded shut. Yet the bell never stopped ringing. Day and night, through storms and sunshine, it tolled its eerie, endless chime, and no one knew why. Simon Graves hadn't been back to Ashford in 15 years. He had sworn never to return. But when his uncle passed away, leaving behind the old family home, he had no choice but to handle the estate. He arrived just before sunset, driving through streets that felt frozen in time. Ashford was small, isolated, the kind of town that time forgot. But as soon as he entered the valley, he heard it. The bell, a deep, hollow sound, ringing from the church on the hill. It sent a shiver down his spine. He had forgotten how loud it was, how it seemed to echo inside your bones. It had been ringing for as long as anyone could remember, and no one ever spoke about it. At the local diner, Simon asked about the bell. The waitress went pale. An old man sitting by the window shook his head. "Best not to talk about it," he muttered. Simon frowned. "Why not?" The waitress set his coffee down, her hands unsteady. "Because talking about it makes it worse." Simon scoffed. "It's just a bell." But the look in her eyes told him she didn't believe that, and neither did anyone else. Determined to get answers, Simon made his way up the hill. The church was exactly as he remembered. Gray stone, weathered by time. The doors were chained shut. The windows were covered with heavy planks, yet the bell still rang. He circled the building, looking for a way inside. Then he saw it, a side door, slightly ajar. His pulse quickened. Someone had been here recently. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside was thick with dust. Pews stood empty, their wood rotting. The altar was draped in cobwebs, and above him, the bell continued to toll. He found the staircase leading up to the tower. Each step creaked beneath his weight. As he climbed, the ringing grew deafening. Then he reached the top, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The bell was massive, rusted with age. But the strangest part? It wasn't attached to anything. No ropes, no gears. It swung on its own, moving back and forth as if some invisible force was ringing it. Simon's hands trembled as he reached out. Then a voice spoke behind him. "You shouldn't have come here." He spun around. An old priest stood in the doorway. His eyes were sunken, his face gaunt. "Who are you?" Simon asked. The priest ignored the question. Instead, he pointed to the bell. "It won't stop, not until it's finished." Simon's stomach twisted. "Finished with what?" The priest sighed, and then he told Simon the truth. A long time ago, the bell was used to warn the town of danger. Fires, floods, attacks. But one night it rang when it shouldn't have. The town had been peaceful, yet the bell tolled endlessly. People woke in terror, and then they started disappearing. One by one, families vanished. Homes were left abandoned. By morning, half the town was gone, and the bell still rang. They tried to silence it. They cut the ropes. They destroyed the mechanisms. But the bell kept moving, and with every chime, someone else disappeared. Simon's heart pounded. "That's impossible," he whispered. The priest shook his head. "You don't understand. The bell isn't just ringing." He took a step closer. "It's counting." Simon's breath caught. "Counting what?" The priest's face was solemn. "The souls it still needs to take." The bell rang again. A deep, shuddering sound. The priest winced. There's only one way to stop it. Simon swallowed hard. How? The priest looked him in the eye. Someone has to take its place. The bell rang louder. The walls trembled. Simon could feel it now, a presence in the tower, a hunger. The priest took a deep breath. I was meant to be the last, he said, but I've grown weak. It needs someone new. Simon stepped back. No, but deep down, he felt it, the pull. The bell wasn't just choosing anyone, it was choosing him. He could run, but the bell would never stop, not unless someone took its place. He looked at the priest, at the rusted bell swinging in the dark, at the emptiness in the air waiting for him. And then Simon stepped forward. The town of Ashford still stands. The church on the hill remains locked, but the bell still rings, not for the priest, not for the lost townspeople, but for the man who gave himself to it. No one speaks his name anymore. No one remembers him. But when the wind howls through the valley, you can still hear it, a deep, hollow sound, ringing forever. There was a house at the edge of the town, standing alone in the thick woods. No one lived there anymore. The windows were dark. The garden was overgrown. The doors were locked. But if you stood outside on a still night, if you listened carefully, you could hear it, a soft, rhythmic creaking, as if something inside was moving, back and forth, the sound of a cradle rocking with no one near it. Emma Fields had always been fascinated by abandoned places. She was a photographer, drawn to ruins and forgotten homes. So when she heard about the Holloway house, she knew she had to see it for herself. The locals warned her not to go. They spoke in hushed voices about the cradle that rocked by itself, about the crying that sometimes echoed from inside, about the Holloway baby, a child that had never grown up, a child that had never left. But Emma didn't believe in ghosts. She only believed in what she could see through her camera lens. So one evening, just before sunset, she packed her bag and made her way into the woods. Holloway House was exactly as she imagined, old, crumbling, forgotten by time. The front door was locked, but Emma found a way in through a broken side window. The inside smelled of dust and decay. Furniture covered in white sheets, a piano with missing keys, faded wallpaper peeling in strips. And in the center of the nursery, the cradle, small, wooden, perfectly preserved, as if someone still cared for it. Emma's breath caught, because even though the house had been abandoned for decades, the cradle was moving. Emma stepped closer, her camera shaking in her hands. The cradle rocked in slow, steady motions, back and forth, back and forth. There was no wind, no footsteps, nothing that could have caused it to move. She reached out. The moment her fingers brushed the wood, the cradle stopped. The room was silent, too silent. Then, a whisper, software, almost a sigh. Mama? Emma's heart slammed against her ribs. She spun around, but she was alone. Emma refused to run. Instead, she raised her camera and began taking pictures. The old rocking horse, the broken toy chest, the faded portrait on the wall. A woman holding a baby, her face blurred by time. She moved back toward the cradle, snapping one last photo. Then, just as she lowered the camera, something shifted in the crib, a dent in the mattress, as if something small and unseen had just sat up. Emma's fingers went numb. She turned the camera's screen to review the last picture. The nursery looked normal, except for one thing. The cradle wasn't empty anymore. Something was in it, something small, something watching her. A wave of nausea rolled through Emma. Her hands shook as she stared at the photo. The air around her grew thick, heavy with something unseen. Then from the cradle, a sound, a soft, slow hum, a lullaby. Rock-a-bye, baby, in the treetop. Emma's breath hitched. The voice was small, young, but it was not human. It was too hollow, too distant, as if the house itself was remembering the song. Then the whisper came again. Mama? Emma's vision blurred. She had to get out, had to run. But before she could move, the cradle rocked forward, and something stepped out. It wasn't a child, not anymore. It was a shape, barely more than a shadow. Its form twisted and flickered, like candlelight in a storm. But its eyes, dark, endless, filled with something like longing, like hunger. Emma stumbled back. The thing reached for her, and as it did, the air filled with cries, hundreds of them, infant wails echoing through the house, rising from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Emma clamped her hands over her ears. The child's shape shuddered. And then it spoke. Stay! Emma's body wouldn't move. The air pressed down on her, thick as water. The cradle rocked faster, faster, faster. The cries turned into screams. Emma's vision darkened at the edges. Somewhere deep inside, she understood. The cradle was never empty. It had been waiting, waiting for someone to take its place. And now, it had chosen her. She felt herself slipping, her mind unraveling. Then, a loud crack. The cradle snapped in half. The screaming stopped, and everything went silent. Emma woke up on the floor. The cradle was nothing but splintered wood. The shadow child was gone. The air was light again. The house was still. She didn't stay to question it, didn't look back. She ran. Holloway House still stands. The furniture is still covered in dust. The piano still has missing keys. The nursery is still empty. But the cradle is gone. Some say it was never there to begin with. Some say Emma imagined everything. But on quiet nights, deep in the woods, if you listen closely, you can still hear it. A soft, rhythmic creaking, as if something, somewhere, is still rocking, back and forth, back and forth. There was a gallery at the heart of town, older than the streets that surrounded it. It had no name, no grand opening hours, no advertisements or promotions. Yet every so often, a new painting would appear in its dimly lit halls, and with every new painting, someone vanished. Elena Voss was an art student with an obsession. She had heard the rumors about the nameless gallery, a place where lost masterpieces were displayed, pieces with no known artist, no records, no history. But it was the newest rumor that intrigued her most, a painting with no name. It had appeared overnight, unannounced, and those who stared at it too long disappeared. Elena didn't believe in superstitions, but she believed in art. And so, on a rainy autumn evening, she made her way to the gallery. The nameless gallery was nearly empty when she arrived. Dim lighting, the scent of old oil paint and dust. She wandered past portraits of forgotten faces, landscapes of places that no longer existed. And then she saw it, a massive canvas taller than her, a gold frame tarnished with age. At first, it was nothing more than a dark, stormy background, like the remnants of a dream half forgotten. Then as she stared, details began to emerge. A forest, twisted and unfamiliar. A shadowy figure standing at its edge, watching. Elena stepped closer. The detail was extraordinary. The strokes too delicate, too real. She swore she could see the trees swaying in a breeze she couldn't feel. The figure in the painting, was it closer than before? She blinked. Yes, it had moved. A shiver ran through her. It had to be a trick of the light. She leaned in, searching for the artist's signature. There was none. Instead, she saw a handprint, pressed into the paint, faint, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. Elena's breath hitched. She looked back at the figure. It was closer now. She could make out eyes in the darkness, watching her. A whisper drifted through the air. "Help me!" She spun around. The gallery was empty, but the whisper hadn't come from behind her. It had come from inside the painting. Elena took a step back. Her heart pounded. She had to look away, had to leave. But she couldn't. Something held her there. The painting pulled at her, an invisible force behind her eyes, beneath her skin. The longer she stared, the stronger it became. The shadowy figure reached out, and Elena couldn't move. Her body felt heavy, the world around her blurred. It was as if the paint was stretching toward her, reaching, grasping, a force dragging her forward. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was her own reflection in the glass of the frame, and then she was gone. Elena woke up gasping, but she wasn't in the gallery anymore. She was somewhere else. The sky above her was dark, painted with storm clouds. The trees around her swayed without wind. The air smelled of oil and dust. And then she knew. She was inside the painting. Her scream echoed into the hollow, painted forest. Somewhere in the distance, other voices joined her. Lost, endless, trapped. She wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. Outside the painting, the nameless gallery remained silent. Another visitor arrived the next day, a young man. He wandered through the halls, eyes drifting from one painting to the next. Then he stopped. His gaze fell upon a massive gold-framed canvas, a stormy background, a dark forest, a shadowed figure watching from the trees. No title, no artist. He leaned in, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw a face in the shadows. A young woman, eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. But when he blinked, she was gone. The shadow in the forest had shifted. It was closer now, and somewhere beneath the layers of paint, a new whisper joined the rest. "Help me!" The young man took another step forward, and the painting waited, hungry, patient, ready for its next collector. There was a lake deep in the northern woods, a place untouched by time. Even in the warmest summers, its waters were cold, but in winter, it was a solid, glistening sheet of ice. Perfect, unbroken, a mirror stretching across the land. But those who lived nearby never skated there, never fished beneath its surface, never dared to step too close, because beneath the ice, beneath the frozen, glass-like surface, memories were trapped. And if you listened closely, you could hear them whisper. Clara Mercer had spent 12 years avoiding Lac d'Echo. She had grown up in the small town on its edge, where the winters were endless and the nights came early. But when she left for college, she swore she would never return. There were too many ghosts here, too many memories. But now she had no choice. Her father was gone, a heart attack, sudden and cruel. And so just a few days before Christmas, she found herself driving back toward the house she had once called home, toward the lake, toward the past she had spent her whole life trying to forget. The funeral was small, a handful of townspeople, the pastor, and a bitter wind that cut through Clara's coat. She barely listened to the words. Instead, her eyes drifted past the gravestones, past the skeletal trees, to the lake. It stretched before her, still and silent, a perfect sheet of ice, smooth as polished glass. Clara's stomach twisted. She turned away. That night, she dreamed of voices beneath the ice, familiar, faint, calling her name. The next morning, Clara woke before dawn. A strange pull settled deep in her chest. Before she could question it, she was slipping on her coat, stepping into the freezing air. Her feet carried her to the lake's edge. The wind had died, leaving the world eerily silent. She looked down. Her reflection stared back at her, but there was something wrong. The reflection wasn't hers. It was a younger version of herself, a girl of 14, and she wasn't alone. A boy stood beside her, dark-haired, laughing. Daniel. Clara's breath caught. She squeezed her eyes shut. When she opened them again, the reflection was normal. She was alone, just as she had been for 12 years. Daniel had been her best friend. Had been. 12 years ago, they had skated together on this very lake, laughing, racing, until the ice cracked, until he fell through, until the black water swallowed him whole. They had searched for his body for weeks, but the lake had never given him back. Now Clara took a step forward. The ice didn't creak, didn't crack. It was as solid as stone. And yet, a whisper curled through the air. Clara. She froze. Her breath turned to mist. Then slowly she looked down. Daniel's face stared up at her, mouth open in a silent scream. Clara stumbled back, heart pounding. It wasn't possible. It was grief. It was cold. It was... The ice shifted, a ripple beneath the surface. Memories began to surge, flooding her mind. The way Daniel had grabbed her hand, the way his fingers had slipped through hers, the way the lake had swallowed him without a sound. But there was something else, something she had forgotten, something buried, a memory trapped beneath the ice. And now, the lake wanted her to see. She should have run, should have turned back, but instead she sank to her knees. The ice was so clear, so thin. She could see everything beneath it, not just Daniel, others, faces she recognized, people who had disappeared over the years, lost hikers, fishermen, even her father. Clara's breath hitched. He had never had a heart attack. He had gone to the lake, and the lake had taken him. The ice remembered, and now it would take her too. The whisper came again. Clara. This time it wasn't just Daniel. It was all of them, calling, begging, her hands pressed against the ice. The frozen surface was warm beneath her palms. She had a choice. She could run, leave this place forever, or she could remember. Slowly she raised her fist, and then she struck the ice. Crack. Once. Twice. Crack. The ice shattered, and the past came rushing back. The next morning, the townspeople found Clara at the edge of the lake, alone, soaked, her breath misting in the cold. But she wasn't the same. Her eyes were distant, as if she had seen something she could never unsee. She left that day, never spoke of what happened, never returned. And the lake went silent again, until the next winter, when another person came, another memory was taken, and beneath the ice, the whispers began again. No one ever meant to arrive in Black Hollow. It was the kind of place you stumbled upon when you took a wrong turn, when the highway signs seemed to point in circles, when your GPS stopped working and your phone lost signal. And yet, despite its isolation, Black Hollow looked perfectly normal. It had a main street with a diner, a post office, a grocery store, and a gas station. It had rows of neat little houses with white picket fences. It had people, doctors, teachers, shopkeepers, children playing in the yards. At first glance, it was like any other small town. But if you stayed long enough, if you looked closely, you'd notice something strange. No mirrors, not in the houses, not in the shops, not even in the bathrooms. And if you brought your own, they didn't work. Michael Carter hadn't planned on stopping. He had been on the road for 12 hours, heading west toward a new job and a fresh start. But somewhere along the way, he had taken a wrong turn. The trees grew denser, the road narrower. And then, Black Hollow appeared before him. The town looked normal enough, but something felt off. The air was too still. The streets were too clean. The people smiled a little too much. Still, he needed gas, and he needed a break. So he pulled into the station at the edge of town. That was his first mistake. The attendant, an older man with sharp blue eyes, filled his tank. Michael went inside to use the restroom. That's when he noticed it. The mirror above the sink. It was blank, not broken, not covered, just empty, like a window looking into nothing. Michael waved his hand in front of it. Nothing. He leaned closer. His heart pounded. And then from the corner of the mirror, something moved, but it wasn't him. Michael stumbled back, heart racing. His mind struggled for an explanation. Maybe the mirror was defective. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But as he left the bathroom, he noticed something else. Everywhere he looked, no mirrors, no reflective surfaces at all. Not in the diner windows, not in the shop fronts. It was as if the entire town had erased reflections. He returned to his car, eager to leave. But the gas station attendant was waiting for him. "You're new here," the man said. Michael forced a smile. "Just passing through." The old man nodded, but his expression was grim. "If you're smart," he said quietly, "you'll keep going. Don't look back. And for God's sake," his voice dropped to a whisper, "don't bring out a mirror." Michael frowned. "Why not?" The old man's face darkened. "Because if you see what's in there," his gaze flicked toward the empty mirror inside the station, "you won't leave." Michael drove away, but the warning clung to him. He should have listened. Instead, curiosity got the better of him. He stopped at a small motel on the edge of town, checked into a room, pulled out his phone, and switched on the front-facing camera. Nothing, just blackness. He turned the phone off, his skin crawling. He rummaged through his suitcase. At the bottom, wrapped in a shirt, was a compact mirror he used for shaving. Slowly, he unfolded it, held it up to his face, and stared into nothingness. His reflection was gone. His breath quickened. Then from deep within the mirror's darkness, something blinked. Not him, not human. Something else. Michael threw the mirror across the room. The glass shattered, and from the jagged shards on the floor, a whisper rose. "Now you've seen us." Michael didn't sleep that night. He sat in the corner of his room, heart hammering. The town was quiet, too quiet. But outside his window, beneath the street lamp, something stood there, tall, motionless, watching. It had no face, no features, just a hollow, shifting shape. Michael squeezed his eyes shut. He had to leave. He grabbed his keys, his wallet, his bag. But when he opened the door, the town was different. The streets twisted in ways they hadn't before. Buildings were wrong, as if they had shifted while he wasn't looking. And there were no people anymore. Just shapes, silent, waiting, watching. Michael ran through the streets, past the church, the school, the empty stores. He reached the town limits, jumped into his car, turned the key. The engine roared to life. He sped down the road, heart pounding, faster, faster. And then Black Hollow was gone. The trees blurred past. The road stretched ahead. He was free, except when he glanced in the rearview mirror. His reflection wasn't there. Instead, the thing from the mirror smiled back and whispered, "Now you belong to us." Days later, another traveler stopped in Black Hollow, a young woman tired from the road. She bought coffee, chatted with the friendly shopkeeper, asked for directions, and when she stepped into the gas station restroom, she glanced up at the mirror. At first, she saw nothing. Then, something blinked. She stumbled back. Outside, the townspeople smiled too wide. The air was too still, and somewhere in the depths of Black Hollow, the shadows watched. It was a simple doll, handmade, delicate porcelain skin, soft curls of golden hair, glassy blue eyes that seemed almost too real. It wore a Victorian-style dress, stitched with tiny lace trim. At first glance, it looked like any other antique doll, but the moment Clara held it in her arms, something changed. The doll's head tilted, just slightly. Its tiny porcelain fingers twitched, barely noticeable. And when Clara raised her hand, the doll's arm moved too, as if it were watching, as if it were learning. Clara was 8 years old when she received the doll. It was a gift from her grandmother, found in the attic of their old family home. A special doll, her grandmother had whispered, pressing it into her hands. Made just for you. Clara had dozens of dolls, but this one was different. It felt heavier than it should. Its eyes followed her, even when she wasn't looking. That first night, as she set it on the shelf, she swore. The doll shifted, just the smallest movement, almost as if it were breathing. The next morning, Clara woke up to something strange. The doll, once neatly sitting on the shelf, was now on her desk, facing her, its tiny hands positioned exactly like Clara's had been when she fell asleep. Fingers curled, head slightly tilted, a perfect mimicry. "Did you move her?" she asked her mother. Her mother barely glanced up from making breakfast. "Sweetheart, you must have done it in your sleep." Clara frowned. She was sure she hadn't. That night she tested it. She placed the doll on the shelf again, this time facing the wall. Then she stood in front of her mirror and raised her hands above her head. The doll, still on the shelf, remained still, but in the mirror's reflection, the doll moved. Its arms lifted, mirroring Clara's exactly. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned. The doll was still, but in the mirror, its head tilted, just slightly, as if it knew. Days passed. The doll's movements became bolder. At dinner, Clara reached for a fork. Across the room, the doll's tiny hand lifted in sync. When Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, the doll's porcelain legs bent on their own. It never moved when others were watching, only when Clara was alone. At night, she woke to faint clicking sounds, like delicate joints shifting. One morning, she woke up and found the doll standing by the door. No one in the house had touched it, and when she backed away, its tiny foot twitched. Clara refused to touch the doll anymore, but it didn't matter. It mimicked her anyway. She covered all the mirrors in her room, but at school, she saw it in the glass of a classroom window. A tiny, ghostly version of herself reflected back. Only, its mouth moved when hers didn't. Clara begged her mother to get rid of the doll. "It's just a toy," her mother sighed. "You're imagining things." But that night, Clara heard it. Soft footsteps, not her parents', not her own. Tiny, delicate. They came from the corner of the room, from where the doll sat. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the covers over her head. Then, a whisper. "Let me be you." Clara shot up, heart racing. The doll was no longer in the corner. It was beside her bed, standing. Its tiny porcelain lips had split into a grin, its blue glass eyes no longer cold and lifeless. They were watching, hungry, mimicking her terror. And when Clara reached for the lamp, the doll's arm moved first, its tiny fingers curled around the base, and then darkness. When Clara's mother came to check on her the next morning, the bed was empty, the window was open, curtains swaying in the breeze. The only thing left behind was the doll, sitting perfectly still, face serene, hands folded in its lap, waiting. Later that week, Clara's grandmother arrived. When she saw the doll, her expression darkened. "I told you," she whispered. Her voice trembled. "This doll was made for Clara." She turned to the empty room. "Now it is Clara." Her mother didn't understand, But at night, when she looked into the mirror, she saw two shadows standing there. One was her own, the other was smaller and smiling, waiting for its next move, waiting for a new owner, waiting for someone else to mimic. The ring was simple, a thin band of blackened silver, its surface dull and worn. No jewels, no engravings, unassuming. And yet, the moment Elias Thorne slipped it onto his finger, the air around him grew cold. Shadows stretched where there should be none. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, curled through his ears. Bound! The ring tightened, just slightly against his skin, and somewhere in the depths of the unknown, something stirred. Elise had always been drawn to forgotten things. Old books with cracked spines, tarnished lockets, faded photographs of people long dead. That's why he found himself in Moriarty's Curiosities, a pawn shop wedged between two abandoned storefronts in the oldest part of town. The shop smelled of dust and time. Shelves sagged under the weight of trinkets no one wanted. But the ring wanted him. It sat in a locked glass case, alone, as if the other items refused to be near it. The shopkeeper, a hunched man with milky eyes, hesitated when Elias asked about it. "You don't want that," he muttered. "Why not?" The old man's gaze was distant. "Because once it's on, it doesn't come off." Elias scoffed. All rings were removable, but when he slipped the ring onto his finger, a sharp shock ran through his bones, like something had latched onto his very soul. When he looked up, the shopkeeper was gone, and so was the door he had entered through. That night, Elias woke to whispers, software urgent, not coming from outside, but from inside his head. The voice was a woman's. "Help me!" He shot up, heart hammering. His room was still, silent, except his breath fogged in the air. And in the corner, just beyond the reach of the dim bedside lamp, a shadow stood, not cast by anything in the room, just a shape, a figure, watching. Elias yanked at the ring, but it held firm. And as the whispering continued, more shadows gathered. The next morning, Elias scoured the internet for any mention of the ring. He found nothing. But when he closed his laptop, a name was scratched onto its surface. Lillian Graves, the voice from the night before. He searched the name. A newspaper article surfaced. Lillian Graves, missing since 1923. Vanished without a trace. Just like that, the whispering returned. "Find me!" And Elias understood. The ring wasn't cursed to haunt the living. It was cursed to bind the dead. Trapped souls, forgotten spirits, and now they had a voice. Elias tried to ignore them, but the shadows followed, dark figures stretching across pavement under the midday sun, faces flickering in windows when no one stood behind the glass. Each night, more names etched themselves into his walls. More whispers filled his ears. He stopped sleeping, stopped leaving the house, because now, they weren't just whispering, they were pleading. Finish what we couldn't. Find our bodies. Avenge us. The ring wasn't just binding them to him, it was pulling him to them, to their unfinished stories, to their graves. Elias gave in. If he wanted peace, he had to listen. Lillian's voice guided him first. A wooded stretch beyond the old train tracks. He dug until his hands were raw, until something cold met his fingers. Bones, her bones. And the moment he unearthed her skull, a scream erupted from the ring. Agony, relief. The shadow standing beside him vanished. Lillian was free, but the ring remained, and more names appeared. Waiting, watching. Elias became an obsession in the town's history. For months he searched. He unearthed the forgotten, gave names back to the voiceless, and one by one, the ghosts disappeared. But the ring never loosened, never lightened. It wasn't meant to be removed. It was a debt, one that could never be repaid. Because for every soul freed, another took its place. The dead were endless, and Elias would never be alone again. Years later, Elias vanished, just like Lillian, just like the others. His house stood empty, his journals filled with names, yellowed with age, and in the center of his desk, the ring, waiting. A new hand would slip it on, and the voices would begin again. The old windmill stood on the highest hill in Black Hollow. Its wooden blades, cracked with time, had not turned in years. Not since the miller Edgar Moore had disappeared. Not since the night the wind died. For decades, the townsfolk whispered about it. How, on the stillest of nights, when not a single breeze touched the valley, the windmill's blades would move, slowly at first, then faster, turning in a wind only it could feel. And with every rotation, something watched from inside. When James Carter arrived in Black Hollow, he hadn't heard the stories. A journalist chasing forgotten histories, he was drawn to the town's silence, a place untouched by time. The townsfolk were wary of strangers, especially those who asked about the windmill. "Leave it alone," the bartender warned. But James was curious. Why would an abandoned windmill turn without wind? And why did no one go near it? That night, he hiked up the hill alone. The air was dead still. Not a single leaf rustled. Not even the crickets dared to sing. And yet, the blades began to move, slowly, groaning. James felt the air grow heavy, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. And in the dark window of the windmill, a shadow shifted, watching, waiting. James spent days digging through town records. He found nothing. No mention of when the windmill was built. No records of its original owner. As if it had simply appeared. But in the library's basement, hidden beneath years of dust, he found an old journal. The name on the cover, Edgar Moore, the town's last miller, the last man to work inside the windmill before he vanished. James flipped through the brittle pages, reading by flickering candlelight. The early entries were ordinary, but then the writing changed, scrawled, desperate, frenzied. "I hear them at night," whispers in the walls. "They beg me to turn the wheel." James's breath caught. "The wind does not move it." "They do." The final entry was barely legible. "If I stop, they will take me too." Beneath the words, a dark stain had soaked into the paper. Blood. James slammed the journal shut. He needed to see inside the windmill. At midnight, James climbed the hill again. The town lay silent behind him. The windmill stood waiting. The door was locked. But when James reached for it, the handle turned on its own. Inside, dust and cobwebs covered everything. The wooden gears, untouched for decades, should have been stiff with age. But the wheel spun freely, moving, grinding. Though no wind touched the blades outside, James swallowed hard. Something else was turning it. Then, the whispers began, low, hissing. Voices in a language James didn't recognize. Shapes flickered in the dim light. Shadows without bodies. They twisted through the air like smoke, drawn toward the moving gears. James stumbled back, heart pounding. One shadow, larger than the rest, drifted forward. And as it did, James saw his own face reflected in its hollow form. A perfect copy, mouth open in silent terror, eyes wide with understanding. The whispers grew louder. Then they spoke in his voice. "You are one of us now." James ran, out of the windmill, down the hill, back to town. But the shadows followed, stretching across the cobbled streets, flickering in lantern light. The townsfolk closed their doors, locked their windows. They knew. They had always known. James wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. Because the windmill needed a keeper, and the wheel could never stop turning. The next morning, the windmill stood silent, its blades still. For the first time in years, James Carter was never seen again. But at night, when the wind does not blow, the windmill turns, and if you listen closely, you can hear a new whisper in the air, a voice begging to be freed. The mask was ancient, carved from smooth obsidian. Its surface shimmered in the dim light. No markings, no embellishments, just two hollow eyes, deep and empty. It had passed through many hands. Some who wore it went mad, others vanished, and those who survived spoke of things that should not exist, things that walk among us unseen. The mask revealed the truth, and some truths should never be known. Daniel Harlow had spent his life chasing myths. As an archaeologist, he had traveled the world in search of lost civilizations, cursed relics, and objects of power. But the mask of hidden souls, that was his obsession. Whispers of it had surfaced in old journals and forgotten texts. A mask that allowed the wearer to see the invisible, spirits, ghosts, beings beyond human understanding. After years of dead ends, he found it in an abandoned temple deep in the jungles of Peru. It sat upon a stone altar, untouched by time, as if it had been waiting. Daniel lifted it carefully, his fingers tingling at the contact, and as he did, a cold breath brushed his ear. Now you will see. Back home in London, Daniel wasted no time. He locked himself in his study, placed the mask on his desk, and hesitated. The air around it seemed heavier, a warning or a challenge. Taking a deep breath, he lifted the mask and placed it over his face. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the room changed. The warm glow of his desk lamp dimmed as if a veil had been lifted. The walls stretched higher, shadows deepened unnaturally, and standing all around him, figures, not human, tall, thin, twisted bodies with elongated fingers and hollow watching eyes. Hundreds of them. They had always been there, and now they knew he could see them. Daniel ripped the mask off, gasping. The figures were gone, or rather, hidden again. His hands trembled as he reached for his journal, trying to make sense of what he had seen. Not ghosts, something older, something that had been watching humanity forever. He should have stopped, should have locked the mask away. But curiosity was a disease he could not cure. That night, he wore the mask again, and this time, the figures moved. They drifted closer. One of them smiled and whispered a name, his name. The next morning, Daniel felt different. The world seemed thinner somehow, as if reality itself was fraying at the edges. People in the streets walked past him, oblivious, but the creatures did not. They stood at street corners, peered from alleyways, hung upside down from lampposts, grinning with hollow mouths, watching him, waiting. Every time he blinked, they moved closer. His hands itched to put the mask on again, to see them clearly. A mistake, but he had already made too many. The voices began on the third night, soft at first, hissing in the shadows of his room, then louder, clearer. You are not supposed to see, but now you do, and now we see you too. Daniel sat frozen in bed, gripping the mask. Outside his window, the street was empty, except for them. Dozens of watchers standing perfectly still, staring up at him, their mouths moving, though no sound reached his ears. Then one stepped forward, a figure wrapped in tattered robes, its fingers too long, its skull-like face tilting. Daniel felt something press against his mind, a voice, deep and ancient. Wear the mask again, and we will show you everything. Daniel did not sleep. He paced his study, staring at the mask. What was the everything they wanted to show him? His heartbeat pounded in his ears. The need to know, to see, was unbearable. With shaking hands, he lifted the mask once more, and placed it over his face. The world shifted. London was gone. He stood in a place of endless darkness. Towering figures surrounded him, their hollow eyes glowing. One of them stepped forward, placing a cold hand on his chest. A terrible understanding filled his mind. They were not ghosts, not spirits of the dead. They were always here, and soon, they would no longer need to hide. They had waited for centuries, feeding on fear, growing in strength. And now that he had seen them, he would be their herald. A week later, Daniel Harlow's house was found abandoned. His study was undisturbed, the mask resting neatly on his desk. His journal lay open to the final entry, a single sentence, scrawled in frantic, shaking script. They are coming. No one ever saw Daniel again. But at night, in the quiet streets of London, people swear they see figures standing just beyond the glow of street lamps, watching, waiting, and in the glass of forgotten windows, a reflection that does not belong. There was a town no map recorded, a place that could not be found unless it wanted to be. Travelers who stumbled upon it never intended to. They arrived by accident, by mistake, or by fate. But once they arrived, they never left. Not because they couldn't find a way out, but because the sky above them was forever black. No stars, no moon, no light beyond what the town itself provided. And those who tried to leave, they simply vanished. Simon Langley had been driving for hours. The clock on his dashboard blinked 3:47 a.m., though he wasn't sure how much he trusted it anymore. His phone had lost service miles ago. The last town he had passed through had been over an hour back, but the road had stretched endlessly with no sign of another one ahead. And then he saw a light, a gas station. The neon sign flickered, barely holding on to life. The station sat at the edge of what looked like a small town, its streets quiet, its buildings dark. Simon pulled into the lot, relief washing over him. He needed directions, maybe some gas, and a few minutes to stretch his legs. He stepped out of the car. That's when he noticed the sky, or rather, the absence of it. There were no stars, no moon, just an endless black void above. Simon shivered. It was unnatural, unsettling. He walked toward the gas station, but as he got closer, something else made him stop. The windows were dark. The inside was empty. And yet, the gas pump still hummed. A fully stocked newspaper stand sat outside the entrance. Simon stepped closer, picking up a paper. The date read October 5th, 1972. He dropped it, his heart pounded. What the hell was this place? The streets were too quiet. Not the stillness of a town asleep, but something deeper, something wrong. Simon walked past houses with lights still on inside, but no movement behind their windows. He knocked on a door, no answer. He tried another, still nothing. He stepped back, his breath fogging in the cold air. The whole town felt like a stage set for a play that had never started. And above it all, that empty, endless sky. Something was watching. Simon could feel it. And then, the lights flickered. Simon spotted a diner at the end of the street. Its neon sign buzzed weakly. Harper's Diner. Open 24 hours. A lie. He expected the diner to be just as lifeless as the gas station, but inside a man sat alone at the counter. Simon stepped in, the bell over the door chiming softly. The man turned, older, with tired eyes and a face etched in shadow. He gave Simon a slow, measuring look before nodding. "You're new." Simon hesitated. Yeah, I guess. What is this place?" The man exhaled. "You should leave." Simon almost laughed. "Believe me, I'd love to, but I don't even know how I got here." The man stirred his coffee, saying nothing. Simon pressed on. "There are no stars in the sky. Why? Where is this place?" The man finally looked at him. "We don't ask about the sky." The words sent a chill through Simon. "Why not?" The man's grip tightened around his mug. "Because if you look too long, it looks back." That night, Simon checked into a motel. The woman at the front desk barely spoke. When he asked about the stars, her expression darkened. He kept pressing. Finally, in a whisper, she said, "The sky doesn't belong to us anymore." Simon lay awake in his room for hours, staring at the ceiling, the old heater humming softly in the corner. But eventually, exhaustion won. He slept and dreamed. He was standing in the middle of town. Everyone was there, the people he hadn't seen earlier. They stood motionless in the streets, their faces turned upward, staring at the black sky, and then, one by one, they began to disappear. Something in the darkness was taking them. Simon woke gasping. A sound filled his room, a whispering, coming from the window. Slowly he turned his head. Outside, the sky was still black, but the darkness was moving. Shapes shifted in the void, watching, waiting. Simon slammed the curtains shut, but the whispering didn't stop. The next morning, Simon ran. He got in his car, gripping the wheel tight. He drove to the edge of town toward the highway that should have taken him home. But there was no road, just more town. Street after street looping back on itself. No matter where he turned, he never left. Simon's breath came fast. This wasn't a town, it was a trap, a prison built beneath an empty sky. Then out of the corner of his eye, a figure, standing in the middle of the street, a man with no face. Simon screamed. Back at the diner, the old man was waiting. Simon burst in, shaking. "There's no way out." The man nodded. "There never was." Simon's breath hitched. "What is this place?" The man took a slow sip of coffee. "This town isn't real." Simon's hands trembled. The man continued. "This is where people go when the sky takes them." Simon's head spun. "The sky?" The man met his gaze. "They came long ago, from the spaces between. The sky was never empty. We just didn't know what was watching." Simon swallowed hard. "Why are we still here?" The man gave a sad smile. "We aren't." Simon's blood ran cold. "What?" The man gestured toward the window. The sky had changed. Not black anymore, but filled with stars. Cold, hunger-filled stars. Simon understood then. They weren't trapped. They were already gone. And the stars, they had just taken someone new. Far away on an empty road, a lost traveler saw a gas station ahead. A small town, quiet streets, a sky with no stars. And, without knowing why, they turned off the road and drove straight into the dark. There are things in this world that slip through the cracks of time. People, places, memories. Forgotten not because they were unimportant, but because something erased them. The lantern found them. The lantern remembered. And once it was lit, so did the one who held it. It had been raining when Daniel Mercer first saw the lantern. He had been wandering the narrow streets of the old district, avoiding the bustle of the city, when he stumbled upon a small, dimly lit pawn shop. It sat wedged between two buildings as if it had been forgotten itself. Its sign faded, the words barely legible. Harper and Company, Oddities and Curiosities. A soft chime rang as he pushed the door open. The air inside smelled of dust and oil, and the shelves were cluttered with things that shouldn't exist anymore. Typewriters with cracked keys, watches with missing hands, porcelain dolls with hollow eyes. And then he saw it. Sitting on a wooden crate, half hidden beneath an old map, was a lantern. It wasn't anything special at first glance. An old oil lantern, its brass frame tarnished, its glass smudged. But something about it called to him. "Good eye." Daniel turned. An old man had appeared behind the counter, his face a web of wrinkles, his sharp eyes glinting with something unreadable. Daniel hesitated. How much? The old man smiled. That's not the right question. The lantern sat on Daniel's desk for 3 days before he finally tried lighting it. He didn't know why he hesitated. Something about it unnerved him, though he couldn't explain why. But on the third night, when the power flickered in his apartment and left him in darkness, he reached for it without thinking. The moment the flame caught, the air in the room shifted. The walls seemed farther away. The shadows stretched in ways they shouldn't. And then, he saw her. A woman stood at the far end of the room, watching him. Daniel's breath caught. His first thought was that she had broken in. But no, she wasn't solid. She was faded, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. And the lantern, it was the only thing illuminating her. She took a step forward, her eyes wide, pleading. "Can you see me?" she whispered. Daniel dropped the lantern. The flame went out, and the woman vanished. Daniel barely slept that night. He told himself it was a trick of the light, his imagination playing games with him. But when he lit the lantern again, the woman returned, and she wasn't alone. Figures flickered in the corners of his apartment. A boy in ragged clothes sitting in the hallway. An old man leaning against the kitchen counter, his eyes filled with sorrow. A young girl standing by the window, tracing shapes in the dust. None of them spoke. None of them moved toward him. They simply existed, waiting, remembered. And then Daniel understood. The lantern only illuminated things that had been forgotten, people who had been lost, memories that had been erased. They had nowhere else to go. Daniel became obsessed. Every night he lit the lantern. Every night more figures appeared. They weren't ghosts. Not exactly. They were something worse. Things the world had chosen to forget. The woman was the first to speak. Her name was Eleanor, or at least it had been. "I was never born," she whispered one night. "Not in the way people are." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" She looked down. "I was erased. I don't remember why." Her voice trembled. "But the lantern does." And then, for the first time, Daniel saw the shape in the shadows, watching, waiting. It took Daniel weeks to realize it wasn't just people the lantern revealed. It was places. It was entire pieces of history. A street that no longer existed. A library filled with books that were never written. A house that had burned down years ago. And yet, when he walked with the lantern, stood perfectly intact. The world was full of holes and the lantern filled them in. But it wasn't alone. Something else was watching. A presence in the darkness, just beyond the lantern's glow. Something angry. Something that had spent centuries removing the things the lantern tried to bring back. And now, it had noticed Daniel. The figures in his apartment began to fade. One by one, they looked at him, fear in their hollowed-out eyes before vanishing. Not because they were moving on, because something was taking them again. And then, one night, Eleanor screamed. Daniel lit the lantern just in time to see it. A shape, massive and shifting, pressed against the edges of reality. A thing with too many hands, too many mouths pulling Eleanor into the dark. Daniel lunged forward, grabbing her wrist, but her fingers slipped through his. "Don't forget me," she gasped, and then she was gone. The lantern shattered. Daniel doesn't remember Eleanor, not fully. Her face is a blur, her voice an echo he can barely grasp. But he knows she was real, and he knows something stole her from existence. He still sees the forgotten sometimes out of the corner of his eye. But the lantern is gone, and without it, there's no way to bring them back. No way to fight the thing that erases. Until one day, in a dusty old pawn shop, a woman picks up a tarnished brass lantern, half hidden beneath an old map. And somewhere, in the dark, something stirs. There are many stories about ghosts that haunt houses, forests, and graveyards. But few speak of the things that haunt the roads. A carriage with no driver, no horses, only the sound of wheels cutting through the fog. And if you see it, it's already too late. Caleb Thornton had always loved ghost stories. Growing up in the small town of Black Hollow, he had heard plenty of them. Stories about the woman in the lake, the church bells that rang when no one was inside, the tree where a man had been hanged and still bled sap the color of rust. But none of them fascinated him as much as the tale of the midnight carriage. No one knew where it came from. No one knew who rode inside. Only that when the fog rolled thick over the moors, the carriage would appear, rolling down the empty road with no driver, no horses, and no sound except the wheels turning against the earth. Some said it carried the souls of the lost. Others claimed it was looking for new passengers. And if it ever stopped in front of you, you would never be seen again. Caleb never believed in the old superstitions, not until the night he heard the wheels outside his window. It had been a foggy evening, the kind where the trees blurred into dark shapes, and even the gas lamps lining the cobblestone streets barely cut through the mist. Caleb had been sitting by the fire, a book in his lap, when he heard it. A soft creaking sound, faint, almost rhythmic. At first he thought it was the wind rattling the shutters. Then it came again, a rolling noise, a sound like carriage wheels. His heart skipped. Slowly he stood and moved toward the window. The street below was empty, but the fog had thickened, swirling unnaturally in the lamplight. And then a shape emerged, dark, looming, a carriage. Its frame was made of blackened wood, its wheels impossibly large, its windows veiled in tattered curtains. But what made Caleb's breath catch in his throat was what wasn't there. No driver, no horses, just an empty bench where a coachman should have sat. And yet, it moved, as if unseen hands guided it. Caleb swallowed, his fingers gripping the windowsill. The carriage rolled past his house, its wheels eerily silent despite the cobblestones beneath him. And just before it disappeared into the mist, the curtains shifted. Someone or something inside turned to look at him. The next morning, Caleb awoke to a feeling of unease. His dreams had been filled with the sound of wheels, the whisper of fabric, the sensation of something watching him. When he got out of bed, he froze, because there, just outside his window, embedded deep into the damp earth of the street, were the impressions of wheels, but not just that, footprints, leading from where the carriage had stopped. To his front door, a shiver ran down his spine. Had someone been inside his house? Had he let something in while he slept? And then, as he moved to pull the curtains open, he saw something even worse. A black handprint pressed against the glass. Caleb wasn't the first to see the carriage. He wasn't even the first to be marked by it. As he searched through old newspapers and town records, a pattern emerged. People who had seen the carriage, who had heard its wheels or glimpsed its shadow, always vanished within the year. No bodies, no traces, just gone. And each time, a new name was added to the list of the forgotten. It had been happening for over a century, and now Caleb knew. He was next. The more Caleb tried to ignore it, the more the carriage returned. Each night it passed his house. Each night it came closer. The black handprint on his window never faded, no matter how many times he wiped it away. And then, one night, it stopped in front of his door. For the first time, Caleb heard something other than the wheels. A knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. A pause. Then a voice, muffled and whispery, from just beyond the door. Time to ride. Caleb stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the door creaked open on its own. Beyond it, fog. Endless, swirling fog. And the open door of the carriage, waiting. Caleb never screamed. No one ever did. The moment he stepped inside the carriage, he felt it. The world outside slipping away, like ink washing from a page. The fog thickened. The houses, the streets, even the stars overhead vanished. All that remained was the road, endless, ever moving. And as he turned, he saw them, the other passengers, people who had once lived, who had once been remembered, now faded, their features blurred, their voices little more than echoes. And as the carriage rolled forward, Caleb felt himself becoming one of them, his memory slipping, his name unraveling, until there was nothing left. Only the road, only the carriage, only the journey that never ended. In Black Hollow, the story of the midnight carriage is still told. A whisper among the townsfolk, a warning to travelers. They say if you hear wheels in the fog, do not look, do not answer the knock, do not step inside. Because once you do, the world forgets you ever existed, and the carriage rides on. It was said that the mirror had been forged in secrecy, its silver frame infused with something darker than mere metal. No one knew where it had come from. No one knew who had made it. Only that those who looked into it never looked away the same, and those who listened too closely were never seen again. The mirror sat in the back of the dusty old shop, hidden behind stacks of forgotten furniture and faded portraits of people long dead. Eleanor Caldwell almost didn't see it. She had been browsing absent-mindedly, fingers trailing over cracked wooden tables and rusted candelabras, until a flicker of movement caught her eye. It wasn't the reflection of the shop she saw in the glass. It was something else. Something waiting. She stepped closer. The frame was elaborate, twisting silver vines wrapping around dark polished wood. But the glass was impossibly smooth, too smooth, as if the reflection was not a reflection at all, but a window. Beautiful, isn't it? Eleanor startled. The shopkeeper stood beside her, an old man with clouded eyes and a voice like dried leaves rustling in the wind. How much? She asked before she could stop herself. The shopkeeper only smiled. For you? A fair price. And so, she took it home and sealed her fate. The first night the mirror was silent. The second night it sighed. The third, it spoke. Eleanor had been brushing her hair when she heard it, a voice smooth as silk curling around her like perfume. What do you desire? She turned, heart hammering. The room was empty, but when she looked into the mirror, the reflection was not quite her own. The woman in the glass looked like her, yes, but her eyes gleamed darker. Her lips curved in a secretive smile, and when she moved, the reflection did not move with her. Eleanor stepped closer. The whisper came again. Tell me your deepest desire. She should have run. She should have smashed the mirror into pieces. But instead, she leaned in, and she answered. At first it was simple. The mirror showed her things she wished for. Success, beauty, love. Visions of a life she could have, if only she wanted it badly enough. But soon the whispers grew darker. Why should she have the job you want? The mirror purred when Eleanor lost a promotion to her coworker. He is already unhappy. Would it be so wrong to take him for yourself? It murmured when she glanced at a man already spoken for. And the more she listened, the more she wanted. Each night the reflection grew more familiar, yet more wrong. It smiled when she frowned. It laughed when she cried. And when she turned away, it watched. The first time the mirror's whispers became real, Eleanor told herself it was a coincidence. She had only thought about her coworker losing her job. But when the woman slipped on the stairs and shattered her ankle the next day, Eleanor's blood ran cold. The second time she tested it, she whispered a name into the glass. A man who had humiliated her once, years ago. 2 nights later, he was found missing, his car abandoned, his house unlocked. No one knew where he had gone, but Eleanor did, because that night, when she looked into the mirror, She saw his face trapped behind the glass. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and beside him, her reflection only smiled. The whispers no longer asked Eleanor what she wanted. They told her, and she obeyed. But the more she took, the less of herself she recognized. Her reflection no longer matched her movements. Sometimes she would glance away, only to see her other self watching her still. And one night, she awoke to find the mirror glowing faintly in the dark, not from the light in her room, but from the inside. And the reflection was not hers anymore. It was her, yes, but it was also the others, all the ones who had vanished, trapped, screaming, and her reflection reached out. For her, Eleanor tried to run, but the mirror was patient. It called to her in the night. It reflected things that were not there. It waited. And one night, when her will was weak and her curiosity too strong, she placed her hand against the glass, and her reflection placed its hand on hers. There was a pull, a sudden, terrible pull, and the world turned inside out. Eleanor Caldwell's house was sold after she disappeared. Her belongings were packed away, scattered to estate sales and antique shops, but the mirror remained. It sits waiting in the back of a dusty store, its silver frame gleaming, its glass impossibly smooth. And if you listen closely when the shop is silent, you might hear it whisper, "What do you desire?" In the depths of an ancient library, where dust swirled in golden beams of candlelight and the scent of old paper lingered in the air, there sat a book no one remembered placing on the shelves. It had no title, no author, no record of its existence. But when opened, it wrote your future, and no matter how much you tried to change it, it was always right. The Blackmore Library had been standing for over 300 years, its towering bookshelves filled with manuscripts, grimoires, and rare texts that scholars traveled across the world to study. Isabel Moreau had worked there for nearly a decade, cataloging forgotten volumes and restoring fragile pages. She had always believed books were magic, not literally, of course, but in the way they held knowledge, secrets, and history, whispering stories of the past to anyone willing to listen. Then one evening, she found a book that whispered back. Isabel had been searching for an old astronomy journal when she saw it, a book wedged between two massive tomes of alchemical studies. She frowned. It was not supposed to be there. The spine was plain, black leather worn with age. No title or markings to identify it. Curious, she pulled it free. It was heavier than expected. The pages inside were blank. At least they were at first. Then as she turned the first page, ink bloomed across the parchment. A single line appeared, as if an invisible hand had just written it. "Tomorrow you will receive a letter that will change everything." Isabel's breath caught. Her fingers hovered over the ink. It looked freshly written. But when she touched it, the words did not smudge. Her heart pounded. It was a joke, a prank. It had to be. Still, she carefully closed the book, tucking it under her arm, and took it home. She told herself she wouldn't think about it again. Then the next morning, a letter arrived, and everything changed. The letter was from an attorney's office in London. Her great-aunt, whom she barely remembered, had passed away, leaving Isabel a manor on the outskirts of town, Blackthorn House, a sprawling estate she had never even visited. Just as the book had predicted, her fingers trembled as she turned to the next blank page. Again, the ink formed before her eyes. "Tonight, you will dream of a door you must never open." That night, as she slept, she dreamed of a door, a heavy oak door in the depths of a house she didn't recognize. And beyond it, something whispering her name. She woke gasping. The image burned into her mind. It wasn't just a book. It wasn't a trick. It knew. And it was waiting for her to turn the page again. At first, Isabel told herself she would not read more. She would lock the book away, forget it existed. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and temptation is even stronger. She opened the book again. This time it was different. Someone you trust will betray you before the week is over. The words sent a chill down her spine. Betrayal? By who? She told herself she didn't believe it, but doubt sank in like poison. Every conversation felt laced with hidden meaning. Every smile seemed like a lie. By the end of the week, she caught her closest friends stealing from her. The book had been right, again. And Isabel realized something terrible. Even if she fought against the future it foretold, it always came true. She should have burned it. She should have thrown it into the fire and never looked back. But she didn't. She couldn't, because she had to know. She turned another page. Another. And the more she read, the more horrifying the predictions became. You will hear footsteps in an empty house. She did. A stranger will call your name in the dark. They did. The book will never let you go. It wouldn't. And finally, you will turn the last page. And when you do, the book will write your end. Isabel wanted to stop, but the book had a grip on her soul. It was like a hunger, like a trap. One final page, one final sentence. With shaking hands, she turned to the very end, and she read, "Tomorrow at midnight, you will be buried beneath the Blackthorn Manor Library, and no one will remember you ever existed." The book fell from her hands. She couldn't breathe. No, it wasn't possible. It had been right about everything else. But this was death. She refused to let it happen. She would fight. She would change it. The next morning, a new book appeared on the Blackmore Library's shelves. Worn leather, no title, no author, no record of its existence. Its pages were blank, waiting. And deep in the foundation beneath Blackthorn Manor, buried in the dark where no one would ever find her, Isabel Moreau's name was forgotten, because the book was never wrong, and the future always writes itself. There is a road that does not stay still. It twists when no one is looking. It bends where it should be straight, and if you walk it long enough, you may never find your way back. The first time David Ellis heard about the shifting road, he thought it was just another small-town legend. "You don't want to take the old logging path," the man at the gas station had said. He was older, with a leathery face and eyes that had seen too much. David had smiled politely. "Why not?" The man had stared at him for a long moment before answering. "Because it don't go where you think it does." David had laughed, thinking it was just superstition, a story to scare out-of-towners. But as he turned onto the narrow dirt road leading through the forest, he couldn't shake the man's words. It don't go where you think it does. The road was supposed to be a shortcut. His GPS had marked it as an old logging route, an alternative to the long highway stretch that curved around the mountains. It was rough but manageable. 2 tire-worn tracks running through thick forest, dappled with sunlight filtering through the leaves. David drove slowly, the occasional bump jostling his truck. 20 minutes passed, then 30. He should have reached the next highway turnoff by now, but when he checked his GPS, the screen showed something impossible. His location wasn't moving. The road stretched ahead unchanged. No crossroads, no signposts, just endless forest. He checked his watch. An hour had passed, but the road looked exactly the same. Had he taken a wrong turn? He should have passed a creek by now, or at least seen the sky open up past the trees. Instead, everything felt identical. A slow unease crept into his stomach. He kept driving. 2 hours, then 3. He should have been out of the woods by now. But the road didn't end. He passed an old wooden fence post with a rusted horseshoe nailed to it. 5 minutes later, he saw it again. Then again. His hands tightened on the wheel. He was looping. He pulled over, stepping out of the truck. The forest was silent. No birds, no wind. Just the sound of his own breath. The road stretched ahead of him, unchanged, unbroken. He turned back, and his stomach dropped. His tire tracks were gone. The dirt was undisturbed, like no car had passed through at all. David did the only thing he could. He kept walking. The truck was useless now. If the road was shifting, he needed to figure out how. He placed a large rock on the ground, marking where he started. Then he walked forward, counting his steps. 100, 200, 500. When he looked back, the rock was gone, no footprints, no marks in the dirt. It was as if the ground had swallowed them whole. His heart pounded. It wasn't just looping. The road was moving beneath him, changing, shifting when he wasn't looking. And worse, it was leading him somewhere. The sun was setting. David knew he had to find shelter before dark. Then, a shadow moved in the trees. At first, he thought it was an animal. Then the figure stepped onto the road. A man, or something that looked like a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in ragged clothes. His eyes were dark, sunken. He smiled. "You're lost," the man said. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in a long time. David swallowed. "Yeah. How do I get out of here?" The man tilted his head. "You don't." The words sent a chill down David's spine. He took a step back. The man didn't move. "This road," the stranger said, "it doesn't lead anywhere. It only takes." David's mouth was dry. "Takes what?" The man's smile widened. "You." Then he was gone. The air where he had stood was thick with mist. David ran. The trees blurred past him. The road twisted beneath his feet, shifting like a snake. No matter how fast he ran, the path kept changing. Then he saw it, a signpost, worn, leaning, its letters barely legible beneath the moss. "Welcome to Black Hollow, a town." Relief flooded him. If there was a town, there had to be people. But as he sprinted toward it, the road dropped away beneath him. The town was gone. The signpost was gone. Everything was gone. And the road, smooth and unbroken, stretched endlessly ahead, waiting. David fell to his knees. He was never leaving. He was part of the road now. And somewhere in the distance, the stranger's whisper drifted through the trees. "It only takes." Weeks later, a hiker found an abandoned truck near the old logging route. The keys were still in the ignition. The doors were open. But of the driver, there was no sign. And if you listen closely on quiet nights, when the wind rustles through the trees, you can hear footsteps on the road. Moving, always moving, even when no one is there.